This is for all the Cholim of Klal Yisrael. And the next chapter we finished with Muktzah. Now we're starting with treating a sick person on Shabbos. There are three categories of a sick person. A serious or life-threatening illness. B, illness without danger. And C, a minor ailment. The first one, seriously ill. Chole sheyesh bo sakana. When there is a risk of life, one must perform malacha in any way that is considered necessary. Communal leaders should set the example by demonstrating this precept and emphasizing the responsibility of this duty upon every individual. For example, internal bleeding, sunstroke, not sunburn, food poisoning, sharp internal pain with sharp internal pain with a suspicion of serious implications, a deep wound, a possible future danger such as an animal bite or insect sting, a serious asthmatic or diabetic attack. Under these circumstances, one is permitted to undergo a surgical operation, telephone for an ambulance or doctor, drive a car, take a patient for treatment or to obtain urgent medicine and cook any necessary food. And the last point of this one, hesitation or delay caused by asking questions at a time when precious seconds are ticking away is considered a piety of foolishness and even tantamount to murder. A person who carries out a malacha in order to help save a life does not need to atone for it. On the contrary, one has performed the mitzvah. And when in doubt, just 3 points here, then we'll continue next time. When in doubt, just 3 points here. One may perform a malacha not only when confronted with imminent danger, but also when in doubt. If one is unsure whether a particular malacha is truly necessary, as there's a chance that it has been performed by someone else, one should still do it oneself. If a doctor advises that an emergency exists, we accept that opinion, even if the doctor is not Jewish or is non-observant. Although the doctor might not appreciate the importance of Shabbos, we're still bound to accept his or her view. If there is no doctor available to offer advice, one must take the initiative to perform any malacha which may help save a life. Even if a doctor is present but considers that no emergency exists, one may still perform malacha if the patient feels critically ill.
All right, guys. Firstly, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Kevin, because every day I learn more halachas because of you, Kevin, really. So thank you. I appreciate it. Seriously.
I also learn, actually. As long as we all learn, as long as it's worthwhile and valuable for it.
We're starting on 50b3. The Gemara challenges Rav. We learned in the Mishnah, if so, why specifically a pit mentioned in the Torah? It's to teach the following. Just as a standard pit has sufficient depth to cause death, being 10 tefachim deep, so too for any obstacle that has sufficient depth to cause death, which is 10 tefachim, one is liable. All is well according to Shmuel, for the expression so too for any obstacle, etc., can be understood as coming to include an elevation. Because remember before we were talking about the fact that Shmuel says, if you build an elevation, like scaffolding, etc., and an animal crawls up and falls down dead, the impact kills the animal, and therefore you're liable. Rav said you're not, because there's not sufficient fumes, and he holds that the foul air kills the animal, because, to cut a long story short, is that he holds like Rabbi Akiva, which means that the owner of the pit is liable, but because it says the owner of the pit has to make restitution, but in the public domain, he doesn't own the sand and the land, etc. So therefore, there's no liability, except as a result of his digging, if it created foul air, at which his activity caused it. I'm not sure why he says that the activity of creating a pit that is sufficient to kill in terms of the impact, one's not responsible for. That I'm still battling with. But Shmuel says both for foul air as well as for impact, you're liable. Okay? Now, my lack of understanding of Rav is not a weakness in Rav, it's a weakness in me personally. But in 120, we'll have a chat to Rav's students, and then I'll figure it out. But according to Rav, what does the expression "so too for any obstacle" come to include? Because again, Shmuel is saying it's included in the case where before we learned that you're liable for the impact, whereas Rav said if an animal crawls up a scaffold and falls off and dies, you're not liable because there's no foul air. So according to Rav, what do you include if you don't include this? It says it comes to include squared off pits and wedge-like pits. So the Gemara objects. Squared off pits and wedge-like pits are mentioned explicitly by the Tana earlier in the Mishnah. Why must he allude to them again here? So what it's saying is that Rav is just saying, look, we learned that there's a Torah source for the pit, a bore, which is classically a cylindrical object, like a well of a cistern, etc., where it's got like that roof which prevents evaporation, as Gavin said quite rightly last time. And you've got your bucket pail, and you've got the rope, and you've got the lever, and you let down the water, and you bring it up, etc., and it draws water. So obviously it's not too wide because you don't want heavy evaporation, and it's very deep to keep the water cool and make sure that you've got a adequate resource. So that's why Rav said, look, at the end of the day, the Mishnah mentions other hazards that you're liable for. It doesn't even have to talk about this excavation. Well, more than an excavation is what Rav was talking about, is that there was an elevation. So let's just define the difference between an escalation and an elevation. An elevation is when you elevate the height, like you're creating a scaffold in order to climb up an area. An excavation is when you dig in the ground. So for an elevation, Shmuel says you're liable because the animal can die in impact if it falls off. But in excavation, both Rav and Shmuel hold liability for foul air, as well as Shmuel holding liability for impact. That's the primary difference. So Rav's saying that the Mishnah is coming to bring other cases than the classical bore. 4 other examples, at which case there was wedge-like pits, there was a ditch, there was a vault, and there was like a square sort of hole, as well as the standard bore, to show you liable for everything. But he doesn't hold you liable for elevation. Why does he hold you liable for the other 4 things in the Mishnah? Simply because the foul air is sufficient to kill. So you could learn that from bore. What do you need the Mishnah to tell you this from? And then the Gemara is going to answer as follows. As it says, having mentioned the different types of excavations listed in the Mishnah, the Gemara asks, and why do I need the listing of all these types of excavations that the Tana mentions? Could he not have mentioned only a pit and allow us to deduce logically that the same law applies to anything similar? In other words, anything sufficient that's 10 tefachim deep that's going to cause death, So the Gemara answers, well, it's actually necessary for the Tana to mention every one of them. Why? Because if he had taught the law only regarding a pit, I might have come to the conclusion that it's only a pit of 10 tefachim that houses foul air. Because let's picture this, guys, there's a pit, it's cylindrical, it's small and it's round, and the air stagnates inside it. But as for a ditch, which is long and more spacious, I would say that even with the depth of 10 tefachim, it does not have foul air that can cause death. So it's saying you'd have to mention it specifically because your logic might tell you that it's not the same as something trapped in a narrow cylindrical area, because why? A classical bore is much smaller, the circumference compared to a ditch. So it's not about the depth necessarily. It's also about the ability for the foul air to escape. Fine. So I would say that even with a depth of 10 tefachim, it doesn't have foul air that can cause death with regards to a ditch. Now remember what a ditch is. A ditch is where you can stick a coffin. It's long and thin. Fine. And had the Tana taught the law regarding a ditch, I might have said that a ditch of 10 tefachim that has foul air, you're liable. Why? Because although it's long, it's rather narrow. So there's not much that can escape from it. But as for a vault, which is squared off and those shapes allow for circulation of air, I would say that even with a depth of 10 tefachim, it doesn't have foul air that can cause death. So what are we saying, guys, yeah? Is that look at a ditch. A ditch is long and thin, you stick in a coffin, and that's that. So it might be better than a pit, because a pit is this long cylindrical thing. But it still can contain foul air, but not enough to kill, because compared to a pit. So the Torah would have to tell me. So not the Torah, the Mishnah would have to tell me. So if the Torah mentions bor and the Mishnah mentions ditch as well as bor, it means we're liable for both. So I could say that that's fine. That's also logical. Why? But in this case of a square vault, it's not logical. Why? Because if you're looking at a narrow area that's long, it's very unlikely that foul air could escape, maybe you would think. Maybe. But for something that's square, picture this. It's 10 tefachim by 10 tefachim. It's a lot of breathing room. So what can you imagine there? That the foul air can escape, guys, right? So you'd say, logically, it's not the same as the bor. And again, this is a problem mainly for Rav. Why? Because Shmuel said, don't make the mistake of thinking that Shmuel says that only impact can kill. He says foul air can kill as well. But in the elimination of foul air, he still holds death liability for impact and damage liability for impact, whereas Rav does not. So what we're saying is here, well, if you're holding according to Rav that it's the foul air that has to kill, if it's square and spacious, there's not sufficient foul air that can't escape. So you would think logically what? A vault we're not liable for, right? Because it can escape. So then, so that's why the Mishnah has to mention a vault, because you would think logically that it's not covered by Rav and you're not liable. Fine. But then you could say, well, then let's look at it and see that there might be an issue. So if the Tana taught regarding a vault, I might have said that it's a vault of 10 tefachim that has foul air, because a vault is covered with a roof so that the air cannot escape. So that's a logical reason. You could say, listen, a vault, it might be spacious, but if the air cannot escape, it's foul, it's toxic. It can, the particles can adhere to your lungs or your wounds or whatever, and therefore for an animal, it could be fatal if an animal fell in. But a squared off pit, again, is exactly the same as a vault. What's the difference, guys, between a squared off pit and a vault? What's the only difference?
No roof. There's nothing covered, no covering.
Correct. So therefore, you'd say for sure a squared off pit that had no means of preventing the foul air from escaping, you're not liable for. That's why I had to mention in the Mishnah, because your logic would tell you you're off the hook. And why does a vault have a roof covering, guys?
To protect things from
exactly.
It's a safety, security thing.
Security and protection. So Kevin mentioned two.
And evaporated.
No, not at all. Because Kevin's right on the two counts. Gavin, sorry, unfortunately here you're wrong. A vault in any classical term is known as a place where you keep valuables. That's why you lock things in the bank vault. So a vault means that you want to protect your goods from being rained on or having the weather elements. Kevin is completely correct there. And he's also correct that you have to secure your goods so that people don't assume that there's anything valuable there. So what happens is, it's like in Vietnam, they used to create these ditches where there was bamboo where you could walk over and foliage, so you wouldn't know that the VC, the Viet Cong, were hiding there underneath there like rats. So the thing of it is, it provided a, what do you call it, a camouflage. So Kevin's right on both things of securing and protecting. Unfortunately, it's not. What, Kevin?
I thought there was an additional one. Kevin, I know, because it's what's it called? It's the vault. I understand that. So he said those two, so I added the third one. I thought it was the third. I thought it also helped with that. That's what I thought. Okay.
Just repeat what you said, Gav, just because I need to
the vault is always for security and protection. So Kevin said that. So then I added the extra one about it also helps with evaporation.
No, but you can't do that because the vault has nothing to do with storing of water. That's purely a cistern.
There's no water in there at all.
Never. It's to protect valuables.
Thank you, guys. All right.
No problem. So a pit, the classical bore is to contain water because that's for a well, where you in the desert for buckets, etc., but not a vault. But then you could think with a vault you're liable. Why? Because you've put a roof, as Kevin said. But for a squared off open pit, you're not liable because, again, it's got a lot of breathing room. The foul air can escape. So, of course, you're not liable there for foul air. So the Mishnah comes to tell you you are liable. Why? Because the minute something is 10 tefachim deep, there's not adequate circulation, even if it's open, unless there's this gale-forced wind that like circulates or a tornado to clear the toxicity at the bottom. It's too big to clear out. Okay? So we have to be taught that in the Mishnah. I might have said that that's one thing, but then you might have said that the reason why, but for wedge-like pits, you might say that you're definitely not liable. Let me tell you why. For squared-off pits, you're liable, but for wedged-off pits, you're not, because squares like this, right? So there's no exact escape route because there's a lot of toxicity at the bottom, with the square. But with a wedge-like, look what happens. There's only a little amount of toxicity at the bottom and a lot of escape room because it's like an upside-down pyramid. So there you would say, for sure, I'm not liable. So in that case of a wedge, you'd say, I'm not liable. And that's why the Mishnah comes to tell you, you are. So for all these things that are in the Mishnah, you're covered because your logic might tell you differently. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Let's go on. So I would say that so anything with 10 tefachim deep has sufficient foul air to cause the death of an animal that falls into it. Okay. So the Gemara starts another challenge. If any of the excavations were less than 10 tefachim deep, and an ox or a donkey fell into it and died, the digger is exempt. But if the animal was merely injured by falling into the pit, the digger is liable. What's the reason that when the excavation is less than 10 tefach deep, if an ox or donkey fell into it and died, the digger is exempt? Is it not because that in the case the excavation lacks the capacity to cause death through the impact of the fall, though it presumably has foul air? Okay? So in other words, according to Rashi, the Gemara assumes that even a shallow excavation has foul air and lacks only the capacity to kill through impact. Okay, so that's the question. And since the Mishnah nevertheless exempts the digger when the animal dies, it contradicts Rav and Shmuel, for both of them say that a person is liable when his excavation causes death through its foul air. So again, we're saying that on Shmuel you'd be covered under the case of impact, but we mustn't forget that both Rav and Shmuel hold liability for foul air. So it does contradict both of them if they say that it lacks the foul air sufficient to kill. Okay? So this reason is rejected. Why? The challenge is rejected. Now, I'm going to just repeat it because I saw one or two of you would just, maybe I hadn't explained it properly. I'm just going to repeat this 2 sentences and it's going to make sense. So again, that we learned in the Mishnah, if any of the excavations were less than 10 tefachim deep and an ox or donkey fell into it and died, the digger is exempt. But if an animal was merely injured by falling into the pit, the digger is liable. So what is he exempt for? For killing the animal. But where is he liable for? For injuring the animal. What's the reason that when the excavation is less than 10 tefachim deep, if an ox or donkey fell into it and died, the digger is exempt? Is it not because in the case the excavation lacks the capacity to cause death through the impact of the fall? Okay, meaning if it's less than 10 tefachim, the impact won't kill it, though it presumably has foul air. In other words, the foul air should kill it. And since the Mishnah nevertheless exempts a digger when the animal dies, it contradicts Rav and Shmuel, for both of them said that a person is liable when his excavation causes death through its foul air. Okay? So the challenge is rejected. No. The reason for the Mishnah ruling it is because an excavation of less than 10 tafachim lacks foul air. So what's proposed here is if it certainly lacks sufficient depth to cause death through the impact of the fall. That's according to Rashi. So then obviously even Shmuel would exempt. But according to the opinion which Rav and Shmuel both agree about the toxicity of the air, the Mishnah's exempting of the digger for the animal's death presents no difficulty according to Rav and Shmuel. Why? Because the Gemara seems to understand that the excavation means that anything less than 10 tefachim has no foul air at all. Okay, so then it doesn't present a problem to Rav and Shmuel. But there's a problem. What's the problem? If you examine the latter clause, guys, of the Mishnah, it says, but if an animal was merely injured only, by falling into the pit, the digger is liable. So how could he be liable according to Rav? Even a Shmuel, but Shmuel says there's injury due to impact as well. But let's say that Rav and Shmuel, they do agree as far as the ability to injure through, foul air. How could there be injury by the foul air when it seems that before that any excavation less than 10 tefachim has any foul air at all? So why would you pay for injury? Do you understand the question, guys? Because it's assuming there's no foul air in the excavation. And in other words, on what basis can the digger be held liable? Okay? So this question only pertains to the opinion of Rav. Why? Since he doesn't consider impact a factor, and you've said a shallow pit has no foul air, how can the digger be liable for damage? According to Shmuel, who holds the digger liable even on account of impact, we can obviously say that the impact of the fall that's a bit less than 10 tefachim is sufficient to cause injury but not death. I mean, you can look at Rashba and Torah Sachaim, they both agreed with that. So the Gemara now assumes that there's a basis for distinguishing between death and injury only with respect to impact, okay, but not with respect to foul air. Because presumably if the fumes in an excavation are harmful, that can cause even death. But if they're not harmful, they can't even cause injury. That's what's being proposed. So the Gemara answers, they say, no. In an excavation of less than 10 tefachim, there's not sufficient foul air to cause death, but there's certainly sufficient foul air to cause injury. Okay. So in other words, there's still some staleness in the air of a shallow pit so that the animal can become severely ill and debilitated by breathing it in. But it's not sufficient to cause death. So before we said, look, it can either kill or it's not noxious at all. And here it's saying, no, there's a certain amount that is lethal and a certain amount that is very injurious. But you can discern that same as impact. Certain falls are lethal and certain ones are injurious. All right, so guys, this is the new ground. We did touch on it briefly, but everybody was exhausted the other day, so I'm going to just go through it. A related incident is cited. There was a certain ox that fell into an irrigation ditch that was 6 tefachim deep. Now, Gavin, this irrigation ditch has water because it irrigates the field around. So 6 tefachim is 1 amma, right? So it was something called amot hamayim, which is the water amma according to Rashi. Okay? So the depth and also the width was exactly 6 tefachim. It was square, Gav. So in that particular case, it was used just to retain water, but not a vault. All right. So there was a certain ox that fell into an irrigation ditch that was 6 tefachim deep, or 1 amma. Its master slaughtered it immediately. And Rav Nachman declared a treifa on account of the injury it was presumed to have suffered in the fall. Okay. Now, let's just examine what this whole issue is about here. Is that What did we learn is sufficient depth to cause death, guys?
More than 10 tefachim.
Yeah,
Or 10 or more. It includes
10 or more. Okay.
10 or more. But that's correct, Kev. That's exactly right. So this is 6 tefachim deep. So basically, the owner of the ox, when the ox fell in, the owner slaughtered it immediately for benefit. And Rav Nachman said you can't get the benefit of eating the meat. Why? Because he declared a treifa. Now, a treifa is anything... look, basically, guys, in Chulin 42a, there are 18 specific physical defects that are presumed fatal. And the question is here, if it's 6 tefachim, how could it be presumed that it could cause a fatal injury? Because the whole argument here is anything 10 or more is fatal, anything less is injurious. So how could Rav Nachman call it treifa when it's 6? That's the question. Does that make sense? In other words, why did he prevent the owner from eating its meat when he slaughtered it? And why did he prevent it? Because if something is treifa, it mentions in Shmot chapter 22, verse 30, that treifa meat may not be eaten because it was something that had a blemish to make it terminal. And therefore, even if you gave it a proper shchita, a slaughter, you can't touch it. You can't touch it. So the Mishnah basically teaches that if an animal falls down from a roof, this is in the classic case of Chulin in the 42nd daf, it's presumed treifa. Why? Because even if there's no visible injury, but it's simply unable to stand up, it's because it's the concern that it might have had a internal bleeding or a fatal internal injury that you can't examine. The very fact that the animal can't stand up means there's a very serious injury that can't be witnessed. It's known as shattering of the limbs. But if an animal survives for 24 hours, the concern is removed. Why? Because it may be then slaughtered and eaten. In other words, surviving for 24 hours means it's not considered dead animal walking. It means that impact is not considered to kill it. So it's the same thing. Similarly, if the animal stands up and walks, it may be slaughtered even within the 24 hours and eaten. Guys, that's it. But the problem with it is in our case, the owner slaughtered the fallen ox before it even stood up and within the 24 hours of its fall. So Rav Nachman therefore forbade its consumption. That's according to Rashi and Tosfot. Does that make sense? But the question remains, and what's the question? How could Rav Nachman consider a treifa if the irrigation ditch is only 6 tefachim deep? Because 10 or more is considered lethal. That's the question. So anyway, there's a comment that Rav Nachman made. He said, if the owner of the ox had taken a cover of flour and gone to the study hall to learn the law, that if the animal suffered a fall lasting a 24-hour period, it's permitted to be slaughtered and eaten, he would not have squandered an ox that was worth as much as many kabin of flour. So what's this thing of flour? Well, this thing of flour is only used as an expression. So Arthur, if I turn around to you and I don't have currency, flour was a currency then, okay, because it was life-sustaining. But if I say, listen, there's two things that are going to happen. What if Arthur turns around to me and he says to me, Damon, you know what? If you just invested 80 Rand and you took an Uber, mate, are you listening? Okay. If you spent 80 Rand and you took an Uber to go speak to the local Rav of the town to get clarity, if you just did that and learned the halacha properly, you wouldn't have lost thousands of Rand on now killing an animal you can't use. What he's saying is always learn the halacha properly first before you make a stupid decision. That's actually what he was saying. We're not talking about flour. He's talking about the fact that you have to invest before making rash decisions. As Bob Dylan says, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. And if you can't quote Bob Dylan in a shir, it's not a shir. I'm kidding.
He's Jewish. His son's
Robert Zimmerman, yeah.
His daughter's, yeah.
Yeah. So,
yeah,
so no, it's not true. You don't have to quote Robert Zimmerman, Bob Dylan, but it does add to a shir's flavor. All right. So the Gemara infers, thus we see that Rav Nachman holds that there is impact sufficiently severe to kill and cause death in the fall of less than 10 tefachim. Okay? In other words, if the impact wasn't strong enough to be fatal, the animal would not have been considered a treif on that basis. So that's how Rashba explains it. It's very straightforward. That's what I like about Rashba. He gives a very clear explanation. Fine. So Rav Nachman's opinion is questioned. Rava challenged Rav Nachman from our Mishnah, which states, if any of the excavations were less than 10 tefachim deep and an ox or a donkey fell into it and died, the digger is exempt. So Rava uses our Mishnah here to challenge this related incident. Okay? What's the reason he is exempt? Is it not because the excavation of less than 10 tefachim lacks the capacity to cause death through the impact of the fall? Okay? So Rava follows the opinion of Shmuel, guys, who maintains that the digger would be liable if the impact had brought about the animal's death. Can you see that, guys?
This is Rava, not Rava.
This is Rava. There's Rav versus Shmuel, and this is Rava who supports Shmuel. Okay, so what we see here is if Rava supports Shmuel, then who does Rav Nachman support?
Rav.
Correct. He supports Rav, because that's the arguing opinion. So that's a good question, actually, that Rava asked, challenge Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman answers, no. It's because an excavation of less than 10 tefachim lacks foul air that can cause death. In other words, he's saying even though it has the capacity to cause death through the impact of a fall, it lacks the foul air enough to cause that capacity. Okay, so when the animal falls in, it's considered treifa due to the impact. However, the digger is exempt from paying damages because one is liable only on account of damage by foul air, not an account by damage by impact. So he's saying, yes, if you're holding like Shmuel, and you contest it based on impact, Rava, yes, 6 tefachim could cause death, but I'm holding like Rav, that says you only pay based on foul air, and since 6 tefachim is not sufficient where the air remains stagnant, I would say in that case the digger is exempt. So again, Rava holds like Shmuel. Right, hang on a second. Rava holds like Shmuel because he talks about impact liability. And Rav Nachman said, yes, the impact at 6 tefachim can cause death, but I hold like Rav, which means impact has nothing to do with payment. It has to do with foul air. There's not enough stagnation of foul air at 6 tefachim to be lethal. Okay. So let's go on. So Rava objects. If so, how will you explain the Mishnah's latter clause? But if the animal was merely injured by falling into the pit, the digger is liable. Why? There's no foul air in the excavation. Does that make sense? How can the digger be liable for injury? So what's Rava saying is that, look, if there's any injury by falling in the pit, the digger of the pit is liable. Now, if you're saying that there's not sufficient foul air in the excavation, how could the digger of the pit be liable? Okay, Rav Nachman replies, he said to him, there's not sufficiently foul air to cause death, but there is sufficient foul air to cause injury. Meaning that it's not a case of all or nothing, that there's either foul air or there isn't. There's a certain amount of foul air that is lethal and a certain amount that's responsible for injury. So if Rav Nachman holds according to Rav, he's saying, yes, but we're talking about 6 tefachim being liable for death. as far as liable for injury, there is sufficient. Does that make sense? There's no issue. It's not all or nothing with the foul air. So then Rava is appeased that he understands that Rav Nachman holds like Rav, and Rava holds like Shmuel that says impact is sufficient to cause injury at 6 tefachim or death. Does that make sense? Okay. But that still is a bit of a problem because it doesn't make sense according to the Mishnah, because we've learned many times before that 10 tefachim or more create death. So even though Rav Nachman said, yes, if you're dealing with impact, 6 tefachim is reasonable to call death, but not foul air. It's not sufficient amounts. So that's fine according to Rav Nachman because he's holding like Rav. But if you're holding like Shmuel, that he's agreeing that 6 tefachim is according to death, that could cause death, Rava and Rav Nachman agree that, then it's a problem according to the Mishnah because we learned that you need at least 10 tefachim to cause death. So this answer is put on hold, and we're going to come back to this issue. But just keep it in mind. Fine. All right. Rav Nachman opinion again is challenged. He challenged Rav Nachman on the basis of a man condemned to death by stoning. Okay? Because Rav holds like Shmuel, which says impact counts. So he said, look, I need to get to grips with this issue. I need to get to grips with the fact that here Rav Nachman is holding, according to Rav Nachman's opinion, that 6 tefachim on impact can cause death. Whereas in the Mishnah, we learned that it's 10 tefachim more. I need to know how Rav Nachman can explain himself. Because if I'm holding according to Shmuel, then it's not a satisfactory answer from Rav Nachman. So Rava now is posing another challenge. Do you understand the question, guys?
Just go through it again. Sorry, I'm just go through it again.
Again, Rava isn't totally happy because he says, yes, Rav Nachman, you still holding, you don't hold by impact, you hold by foul air. Fine, you hold by foul air, I get it. But if you had to hold by impact, you now saying that 6 tefachim can cause death. There's no liability by you because you're saying that it's only for foul air. You're according to Rav. But I'm holding according to Shmuel. So I hold by impact. So if you're saying 6 tefachim is enough to make an animal treifa, it argues with our Mishnah here. It argues with our Mishnah here that says it's 10 tefachim that can cause death on impact. You need to explain yourself.
It contradicts the halacha.
Well, it contradicts our Mishnah, Rav Nachman. So we don't know what the halacha is yet.
Is that not a halacha?
We don't know yet. We don't know yet. Remember, the Gemara is your trial basis. The halacha comes out from the Gemara. Now, what's interesting is the Rambam has got a work called Mishnah Torah. Now, the Mishnah Torah that's available, that many Chabad people have in Hebrew and English, deals with issues like from the Mishnah Brura, but very few of them I've seen in South Africa have that volume for Bava Kamma. I want to order for us guys overseas the English book by the Rambam that deals with all the halachas in Bava Kamma that are actually derived from all the Gemaras. In other words, what happens is if you look on the page of the Gemara, it shows you where how the halacha is eventually derived, which is very interesting.
That was very interesting. Thanks for sharing that based on my question or my comment. The fact that halacha is never derived from the Mishnah, it's always from the Gemara. Thank you.
No. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is, apologies, let me make this clear, is that the Gemara explains the Mishnah, but you can't assume from the Mishnah and the Gemara, if there are two arguments in the Mishnah and they're contradicting Mishnahs, that we know the halacha. What happens is the Rambam, where we hold by Maimonides, says, who do we hold by today halachically? He took the Gemara and he made it modernly how we derive halacha. In other words, who won at the end of the day when you've got two conflicting opinions? Because you've got all these myriads working together. So often the Mishnah does contain the halacha, but if we have two contrasting mishnahs that both are right, how do we come out with the halacha? That's a different discussion. Rabbi Khan will go through it with us one day. But anyway, we're sitting here at a problem because we're sitting here with this incident by Rav Nachman that holds impact fall at 6 tefachim can cause death, but you're not liable because he holds by Rava foul air. Rava holds by Shmuel that says foul air does kill and you're liable, and impact kills and you're liable for both. So the reality is if the impact is enough to create death, even if the foul air isn't, you're liable. So if our Mishnah turns around and says you need at least 10 tefachim, you're liable. How does Rav Nachman deduce that 6 tefachim is enough to create death when the Mishnah says it's 10 or more? Okay, so Rava now is going to hammer Rav Nachman with another question. And what's the question? This is something that Gavin and I learned from Sanhedrin. Okay? No, Gavin, I learned this from Rav Simcha. You weren't there yet at Maharsha, but let's just go through it, okay? We learned, it's in Sanhedrin on the 45th daf, okay? So he challenged Rav Nachman. Rava challenged Rav Nachman on the basis of the following Mishnah in Sanhedrin 45a, which describes the procedure for executing a man condemned to death by stoning. So the elevation of the stoning grounds was twice the height of a man. So how high is a man, guys? Is 1.5 amas. The average height of a man is 3 amos. Is 1.5 meters. How much is an amma, Kevin?
Half a meter.
Okay, so that makes sense. It says then if a man, average height of a man is 3 amas, which is 1.5 meters. Is that right?
Yeah.
So man is at max about 1.5 meters. So what it's saying is that the scaffold was made is twice the height of a man. So the elevation of the stoning grounds was twice the height of a man, meaning 6 amos. So that when the man condemned was placed at the edge of this elevation and pushed off, he could die from the fall alone. So again, Rav Nachman says, you at 6 tefachim you liable, and we learned that 6 tefachim equals 1 amo, right? With the irrigation ditch, right? So this is 6 times the lethal dose. That's what Rav is saying. He said, when we create a death for a person by making this scaffold, we put them at twice the height of man, which is 3 meters, which is 6 amos. Kev, you shaking your head?
No.
Okay, so what I'm saying is this. 6 tefachim is 1 amma, okay? And we're saying a man is 1.5 amma, which is 1.5 meters. The scaffolding that he has to jump, that he's pushed from, is twice man's height, which basically means 3 meters he's pushed by, above man's height. So he's actually pushed, if you look at, if it's double man's height, the scaffold, that's 3 meters plus man is 1.5 meters. So it's actually 4.5 meters that he's diving, that he's being pushed from in a standing position. So that 4.5 meters is 6 times half a meter. Because 6 tefachim is 1 amma. 1 amma is 50 centimeters. So if the scaffold is 3 meters instead of 50 centimeters, it's 6 times the height that we're creating the scaffold. In other words, what Rava is saying is that when we condemn somebody to death, we actually put them at the scaffold level of 6 times what Rav Nachman would consider lethal. And why would we put them at such a high elevation if 1/6 of it is enough to create death? Possibly. Does that make sense? It's a good question. So I think...
The answer is special kindness. That's the answer.
Okay, so we're getting there. So Arthur's done his homework. We've got to give Arthur 10 out of 10 there. So exactly. So Rava challenged Rav Nachman on the basis of the following Mishnah in Sanhedrin 45a, which describes the procedure for executing a man condemned to death by stoning. The elevation of the stoning grounds was twice the height of man. Man himself is 1.5 amas, and the excavation was 1.5 amas times 2, which is 3 amas. Okay. Which is basically plus man, which is 4.5 amas. So that's 6 times the height of what Rav Nachman would consider lethal. So when the condemned was placed at the edge of this elevation and pushed off, he could die from the fall alone. Okay? And it was taught in the Bryce about this Mishnah, and there was his own height too. Thus we have here an elevation that is 3 times the height of a man. 3 times the height of a man. Now, if you should think that there's an impact sufficiently severe to cause death in a fall of less than 10 tefachim, why do I need so much elevation in the stoning grounds, even if an elevation of less than 10 tefachim would suffice? Okay? So the Gemara retorts exactly as Arthur said, and even according to your reasoning that a fall of less than 10 tefachim cannot cause death, let's make the stoning grounds 10 tefachim high. So the Gemara is saying, all right, let's make it like this. Let's forget about the 6 tefachim. Let's say 10 tefachim high. Why would you need the scaffolding to be like double that of the 10 tefachim high? Because 10 tefachim is enough to cause death. How do you yourself explain the necessity for a height of 3 men? Rather, the stoning grounds were elevated to a height in accordance with another dictum of Rav Nachman, which is exactly what Arthur said. For Rav Nachman said that in the name of Rabba by Avuha, Scripture states, you shall love your fellow as you love yourself. Okay? So where's this? In Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. And basically, in other words, what does this mean? Is that if a person is condemned to die, you have to choose a favorable death. If you choose a fall from a higher elevation, it can kill immediately, less pain. And that ordained with the fact that we have to obviously create somebody to get the death penalty as prescribed, we want it to be painless. Remember, 10 tefachim cause the potential of death. At that point, you're liable. But it doesn't mean it's a quick death or a painless death, nor that it will definitely cause death. So we want to make sure that this person will die for sure in the least painful way. So then the Gemara asks, if so, let's raise the stoning grounds even more. In other words, let's be doubly sure. So why don't we do it much higher, Arthur?
Say that again, mate. Why don't they do it much higher?
Yeah, the Gemara is saying, okay, again, Arthur's completely correct.
Okay, because technically he is at the right. If he's 6 plus 3 or whatever it is, he's already falling at 10 amma.
No, that's not the right answer. You got the first one right.
No, that's a count.
You got it right. The first part. So the thing of it is, 10 tefachim can possibly cause death. It's enough where somebody's negligent and liable to cause somebody death. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they will die. And it doesn't necessarily, because it depends how they fall off. They could fall badly. Where if they fell head first, it'll kill them. Spot on. They'd split their pip open. No doubt they would die. But if they landed off on their legs or their back, they'd be injured. They wouldn't be dead. So the thing of it is, you're liable in case the person dies because it's lethal. But you can't guarantee death. What happens is when you make a scaffold twice the height of man, plus add the height of man, believe me, no matter which way it falls, the guy's tickets. The reason you don't make it more than the height of 3 amos plus man, which is 4.5 amos, is because you don't want the body, the Gemara says, to be grotesque upon landing. Meaning, if you make it like the Empire State Building, the person they're going to be a tomato stain. That's not very dignified for the family. You need a spatula to scrape them up. This is not what we want. That's not kind. So what?
If I was being pushed off, I'd rather just flat.
No, you would, but if you have a loved one that had to identify you, it's not ideal. What you want is the sweet spot, Arthur. You want the sweet spot where. No, in other words, a quick, painless death without it looking like a stain on the pavement. The sweet spot. So the Gemara says the sweet spot is twice the height of man plus man. No grotesque body, quick and painless death. So that's what we're looking for. So even though this answers the question. So to Rava, what's the question to Rava off? Is Rava says, how can you call 6 tefachim death when we create a lethal scaffold where somebody's going to get executed? And the answer to Rava is very clear, as Arthur said. It's a kindness. If you forget about the 6 tefachim, the Gemara says even if you say 10 tefachim, it can create death, but it could also result in a very bad injury. It doesn't guarantee death. It's just liability because it could be lethal. But at twice a height of man, for the scaffold plus man, guaranteed death, no grotesque body, the sweet spot. Okay, so that being the case, we're going on to the next part. Arthur, well done for the Chazorah. Much appreciated. You did well. Right. Now, yet another challenge to Rav Nachman. He challenged Rav Nachman from the following brisa. Rav is not giving up, guys. The Torah states, if you build a new house, you shall make a fence for your roof and not place blood in your house, because a falling one may fall from it. So where do we see this? We see this in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 8. That basically, that you have to, if your house, if you've got a roof, people used to do stuff on their roof. They didn't fix the DSTV aerial because there wasn't DSTV, but apparently the roof was, I think, rather flat, and people would use it like as another layer, maybe a little pool, a sunbathing. I don't know what, no, you couldn't, sneert or whatever, but maybe they would use it as like a patio area for a braai. But you'd have to create a fence around the roof that's more than 10 tefachim. Why? Because the fall from there would be lethal. Otherwise, you've got blood in your hands. That's what it says in Deuteronomy. That's your obligation.
Yeah, that's halacha anyway. You have to.
Halacha, exactly. That's the halacha. Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 8. So what's this question now by Rava to Rav Nachman? Is he saying, look, that's when the roof is higher than the ground below. Okay? That's the halacha. But that's not the halacha when the ground below is higher than the roof. So you guys might be confused. So let me give you an example. Kevin knows this, Arthur knows this. Gav, you might not be too familiar, is that if you go to Hanof in Israel, in Jerusalem, it's like Middle Earth in the Hobbits. There's these areas. It's beautiful. I love Hanof. So
yes, it's a beautiful view, mountain view.
There's these mountains on the top, and they go like this, and there are properties all around. So what could happen is the bus goes up the mountain pass like this, Gav. It goes up the mountain pass. So you could have a house that's here, that your ground is level ground, and then if you fell 10 tefachim, you could land on the roof below, of the street below, because it's on the mountain. You had a higher point of the mountain. That's all, in our north. So what it's saying is, Rava is saying, well, the halacha only obligates you if your roof is higher than the ground by 10 tefachim, you've got to create a fence. But if you're on the ground below and there's a sheer cliff face that it falls like that 10 tefachim onto the next guy's roof, and that's 10 tefachim, that's lethal, why don't you have to create a fence there in that case? Because again, if you're talking about impact being 10 tefachim causing the lethal thing, what difference does it make? Which one is, if the one was a roof and then there's a fall to ground, or if it's the ground and then there's a sheer cliff face to the roof below. Either way, 10 tefachim could kill. Why aren't you obligated to create a little fence around the level ground area? Because you could still fall down 10 tefachim to the roof below, like in Hanov. You see the question?
Yeah.
Okay. So, the reality is, the verse implies that a fence is required when there's a concern that someone may fall from the roof to the ground below, but not where there's a concern that someone may fall from the ground into the roof. If the level of the public domain was 10 tefachim higher than that of the roof, so that one could fall only within the public domain into the area of the roof, the house is exempt from the requirement of a fence. But if the level of the public domain was 10 tefachim lower than that of the roof, so that one could fall from within the roof area into the public domain, the house is subject to the requirement of a fence. At any rate, we see that this brisa, that the requirement pertains only when the roof is at least 10 tefachim higher in the ground below. Okay? Now, if you should think that there's an impact sufficiently severe to cause death in a fall of less than 10 tefachim, why do I need the house to have a height of 10 tefachim in order for a fence to be required? All right. So Rava's question, I apologize, guys, is not the same as my question. My question is, if 10 tefachim is lethal either way, why are you subject to put a fence around your roof, but you're not subject to put a fence around the cliff face where you could fall on somebody's roof? That's my question. Rava's question isn't that. Okay? Rava's question is, since the halacha states that 10 tefachim is considered lethal, and that's why we put a fence to protect from death, then how could Rav Nachman say that 6 tefachim could be lethal with regards to impact of a fall? That's the question. Sorry, I have a different hang-up. They're both valid, but the discussion here is going according to Rava is far more esteemed, and it's dealing with this issue pertinently. Fine. So the challenge is rejected. Rav Nachman replied, the requirement to make a fence on the roof of a house is different, since any structure that is less than 10 tefachim tall is not considered a house, and in the verse cited, the Torah requires a fence on the roof of a house. So what are we saying is here? In other words, any structure that does not meet the criteria of a house, in other words, one that is less than 10 tefachim tall or less than 4 amos squares, is excluded from the requirement of a fence to have its roof. Okay? Now, so this reminds me of a case that when I visited Egypt, I noticed that there weren't, I spoke to the guard, and I noticed that there weren't roofs off when I went to Egypt via Israel. I noticed that in some of the properties, in the buildings or whatever, there was not a roof. So I said to the guard, what sort of people don't have a roof on their house? This is like Soweto. Alex, they even have a roof. Our guys are much more advanced here. How can the Arabs not have a roof? So the guard
had a roof at the house.
No, there's no roof. Trust me, I was in Giza.
Giza, where the pyramids are.
The pyramids. So, Gav, just hear the story. So, listen, there was no roof, okay? So I asked John the guard. I was with Rabbi Rappaport's son and Dr. Daniel Israel. So what we did is we took a flight via Egypt so that we could visit the pyramids and just to get a sense of Pesach was coming up, of like what it was like. It was a wonderful opportunity. But I noticed so this guy, John, says to me, it rains twice a year. He said, it's Egypt. It rains like, I said, nonsense, John. In winter, it rains. You're not that far away from Israel. We know winter's a rainy season. It rains. What's the matter here? So he said, no. He admitted the reason. He said, look, he said, at the end of the day, you pay a roof tax on your property, meaning the house is considered a house legally when the roof is on top. When the roof is on top, it's considered a completed house, and at that point, you pay the government tax. All these Arabs don't want to pay the tax, so they don't build a roof. Okay?
But you can see their cousins are quite smart.
Yeah, so Kevin, I want to ask, all right. So listen, I think, so the question is, okay, so we know that you don't have to build any structure, of Nachman is saying, on a roof that contains, that's less than 10 tefachim high, not because of the lethal nature. It's lethal at 6. It's merely because it's not considered a house legally unless it's high enough to house people that can walk in and 4 amas wide. If it's not considered a house, there's no legal obligation to build a fence around the roof. That's what he's saying. That's his response to Rava. All right, guys, we're going to end off on this note. I hope you've been happy with the share.
Yeah, very good. Scarf. Thank you, Damon.
All right, guys. Thank you. Have a wonderful...
See you tomorrow. You too.
Please send me the notes or to the group so whoever needs it can access them.
All right.
Bava Kamma.
Fine. 2:30 South African time to share tomorrow. I'll send the notes immediately. Guys, you all prepped. I could see you knew what was going on. Thank you for the time.
Pleasure. Thank you as well.
All right. May Hashem bless you all with a good week. Amen.
Amen. Gam lecha.